Welcome to this month's Pride program, the religious and political agenda against trans lives, alternative faith perspectives. My name is Stephen Slaba, and I serve as the co-director of Interfaith Action here in Southwest Michigan. And we are just really and truly delighted that you've all joined us for this important conversation. As you all know, in recent times, religious groups have aligned with political entities to oppose trans-affirming practices in various spheres, ranging from public library resources to trans-supportive health practices. And as local and national debates on these issues intensify, it's crucial to explore alternative voices within faith communities that advocate for trans-affirming practices. This evening, we'll have the opportunity to hear from representatives from Christian, Jewish, and Muslim backgrounds on this topic. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So before we get started, I want to extend our gratitude to our co-sponsors of this event, the Episcopal Diocese of Michigan, the Episcopal Diocese of Northern Michigan, and the Episcopal Diocese of Eastern and Western Michigan. So a lot of Episcopalians, so thank you for your support of this event. And I also want to say a word of welcome to our facilitator this evening, the Reverend Dr. Simone, who is the founder and emeritus director of Interfaith Action. He is also our acting coordinator of interfaith relations and public theology. So we're so thrilled Sid is still on with us at Interfaith Action. For those of you who don't know, Reverend Moan was ordained as a clergy person within the United Church of Christ in 1976, the first openly gay person ordained in the Illinois Conference of the United Church of Christ, and the second openly gay person ordained nationally in UCC. Reverend Moan has been active in advancing the leadership of LGBTQ individuals within the local, regional, national, and international communities and institutions of faith. So no better person to lead this conversation. So Sid, I'll turn it over to you to introduce our panelists and lead the discussion.
Okay. Thanks, Stephen. Indeed, this is regrettably a very timely conversation. The trans legislation tracker currently indicates that it is following 550 anti-transgender bills in 49 states throughout the United States. Self-defined Christian pastor Jason Graber recently called for the execution of all LGBTQ people, as well as the parents of transgender people. With this quote, they just need to be shot in the back of the head, and then we can string them up above a bridge. The Catholic Bishop of San Francisco, Bishop Cordileone, has called trans people a threat to the church. These statements are all evidentiary of an alignment between right-leaning religious groups with political parties. And as Stephen said, this includes right-leaning religious voices from Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions. And the alignment is very evident here in the United States, but also in Russia, Hungary, Israel, Turkey, Uganda, just to name a few of the current hotspots of anti-LGBT and trans efforts. Reflecting today at the beginning of Pride Month, it was in 1969 in the Stonewall riots, which protested police raids on LGBTQ people. Those riots were led by trans people who were on the front lines of the attacks. 50 years later, trans people are still on those front lines. So let's get started with our conversation this evening. I'll do a brief introduction of our four guests. First, we have Dr. James Whitehead, who received his PhD from Harvard. Jim has focused his work as a theologian on the interplay between religion and culture. He, along with his wife, Evelyn, a developmental psychologist, were seminal Catholic thinkers of affirming sexuality and embodiment and paving the way for a groundbreaking spiritual views on gender, gender identity, and sexual orientation. Their book, Fruitful Embraces, one of 15 books they have written, is evident of their work in this area of human sexuality and culture. Another one of their books, Holy Arrows, Pathways to a Passionate God, won an award from the U.S. Catholic Press Association. Meghan Buell is founder and board president of a not-for-profit organization called TREE, which stands for Transgender Resource, Education, and Enrichment Services. It is a pioneering not-for-profit in the US, which focuses its work on providing trans resources in rural communities. Meghan's first book, which has been co-authored with Jim, was published in late April, is entitled The Road to Me, A Transgender Journey, and it is available through Amazon. Rabbi Simone Schicker is the rabbi of Temple B'nai Israel in Kalamazoo. She studied at the Hebrew Union College, both in Jerusalem and in Cincinnati, and at its Institute of Religion. While there, she was president of the Rabbinic Student Association and instrumental both in forming and serving as a leader of the Student Gender Task Force. Maher Alhaj is a Palestinian Muslim born in Jordan after his family was displaced from their home in Palestine. The family later moved to Michigan and he studied in the Dearborn area. Maher received his Master's of Divinity from the University of Chicago Divinity School, and his thesis was on Islam, the West, and queer politics. Maher has founded an initiative, Halal This Way, towards a visible queering in Sunni Islam. The project is anchored by a book of the same name. So let's get started. Jim, you've been a pioneering Catholic theologian over many decades, affirming perspectives on gender and sexuality. Over the past decade, you've turned attention to issues of trans identity. So, two questions for you. What motivated you to that focus as a Christian? What led you to your current interest in and writing on trans rights? And secondly, what counter message, if any, do you have to Christian voices that seek to restrict rights and inclusion of trans people?
Thank you, Sid. In 1970, Evelyn and I got married and began our joint ministry of teaching together, relying on her background in psychology and my interest in spirituality. And both at Notre Dame and then at Loyola in Chicago, from the very beginning, we were approached by our graduate students. These were people between, say, 25 and 45, many of them gay. And they just wanted to talk about their own sexual life and their desire to be with another and find fruitful love. And I don't know why they picked us. I've asked God many times and God hasn't answered yet, but they did come to Jim and Evelyn. So over the years, they taught their teachers that this desire to move out of aloneness and find committed sexual love is part of all of our journey in life. And it's one of the great graces that we received in our marriage. Then around the year 2000, we turned to interest in transgender. It was becoming an important question about that time. And when we met the first trans colleagues, who of course became friends quickly enough, we were met with within ourselves a range of feelings, from uneasiness and perplexity to something I'll call bewilderment. And at the time, we were writing a book on the negative emotions and how negative emotions like anger and fear often have a gift kind of hidden inside that we have to learn from. And we began to wonder if bewilderment is something like that. We found one scholar who talked about the definition of bewilderment as a salutary emotion because it rescues us from our unwarranted certainty. And in this whole realm of transgender today, there are many, many people who speak with a great deal of unwarranted certainty as though they knew the ways of the Most High. And so that we began then to try to understand and define bewilderment and maybe how it relates to this question of transgender. And we came to see that the virtue of bewilderment disarms us from long cherished convictions about how we're right about many things. And then we began to see the connection between the emotion of bewilderment and in our scriptures, the experience of wilderness. So that the iconic relationship or experience of the Israelites escaping Egypt, getting out in the desert, being in the wilderness itself and themselves becoming bewildered, saying to their leaders, so what, we got freedom and now you brought us out here to die? And then it even seems that the story of bewilderment in the desert, in the wilderness, is part of the plot, even to the extent that the writers of the New Testament felt they had to have Jesus spend 40 days in the wilderness at the beginning of his career, almost as some kind of novitiate or entry passage for what was to come. So we came to see the emotion of of bewilderment, as what happens when the wilderness comes indoors, when it invades even our own heart. But the question remains, what is its gift once it unfastens us from our certitude? And it may be that it's a path to the extravagance of God. Just a few remarks about that. I've come to see over the years as God's extravagance as the signature of creation. I think many of us grew up with the sense that God is kind of a quid pro quo God. You get what you deserve. That's definitely not the case, which is to our advantage. Or that we reap what we sow. We reap what our ancestors sowed. And we inherit what we have no right to. And these days, with all the research and telescopes giving us information about the cosmos, God's extravagance is on display. One way to say it is, surely one galaxy is enough. How many galaxies do you need? But hundreds of them? Or the notion that we have 400 species of ants. This is really an awful lot of ants, Lord. But it's a function of God's extravagance. God is by definition someone who doesn't know when to quit. So keeps living us beyond our deserts. And so I guess this is the punchline to this brief discussion. God's extravagance explodes our nicely organized binary world. And we had been warned about this in Galatians 3, the seemingly essential binaries of Jew and Greek, slave and free, male and female collapse in this new creation. So the spiritual journey, we're convinced, often moves from bewilderment, a disorienting feeling, to God's extravagance, which is also disorienting because it's too much for us to grasp. We used to think that we understood what God was doing. Not so. And so, final word, God's extravagant love for our transgender siblings should not distress us, but should bedazzle us. That extravagance is just another word for grace. Amen.
Wow, powerful words, Jim, and an important counter perspective in religious and political debates around who to include in a non-extravagant perspective. Meghan, you've recently written your first book, The Road to Me, a Transgender Journey. What motivated you to write that book, and why did you choose Jim as a co-author?
There we go. Unmuted. Hi. My name's Meghan, pronouns she and her. And, The Road to Me, the book I wrote, is really all because of the nudging and prodding of Jim. Jim and Evelyn and I became colleagues and friends, over the last 7-8 years or so. And every time we would talk about, and I would share some of my stories, they would tell me that you need to get these into a book. And I never see my journey and my life as spectacularly as everyone else seems to see it. When you're living in it and you're just trying to survive this thing called life, you tend to not look at it as anything that's spectacular. But others hearing the stories, and Jim and Evelyn really on the forefront of pushing me, along on that, made me understand that some of my stories might resonate with folks. And if one story resonates with one person and gives them the hope to continue forward on their own journeys, then I needed to share those stories. I am not an eloquent writer or speaker, like Jim just showed us he was, but the words are honest and true and from my heart. And folks that have read it have commented to me that it's like I'm standing there just talking to them one-on-one. And I think that's a communication skills that really connects people to the fact that I, as an out and proud transgender person, really is a person first, a human being first, and that being transgender is just one sliver of my overall identity. And I think when people can read those words and listen to them, maybe they'll forget that it's a transgender journey and it's just a human journey.
Well, Meghan, how has faith or religion or spirituality played either a positive or a negative role in your journey?
Yeah. I was raised in a Catholic household, went to parochial school through grade 8. I wouldn't call our family like extremely Catholic, but faith was always a constant as far as, guidance and a guiding tool for, trying to make the best decisions possible. I feel I'm actually a stronger person for going to parochial school, because I think that's it was strict, as most of you probably know. And I think, and I've learned this also as a teacher, that you can always loosen up a bit from being strict, but it's hard sometimes to get stricter when you've been loose with people. And so I think, first through eighth grade being a very strict, educational system allowed me to then broaden my perspective of what else could be out there and open the door for me even to think of the possibility that I could be anything but in the binary, because those rigid rules I found were very pliable, and I could move them around and make them fit for me. Now, I'm all about process and structure and organization. I think that comes from that. But I have learned to be able to look at life and all the things that happen in life from another perspective. And I think that is a learned thing from being in a very strict, parochial education. As far as in my everyday life, I do not attend services, but I do not hold religion against others unless they are trying to use it to harm me and people who identify like me. And then I think that those folks are missing the macro message of love and support and lifting everybody up to the same level, and they're failing in their own ideals of faith. And I think, well, here's the story. So a coworker of 14 years, when I decided, made the announcement I was going to transition, asked me if I was going to forfeit my opportunity, and chances of going to heaven. And I answered saying, at the end of the day, I think if you live an honest, open, authentic, truthful life, you have as good a shot as anyone else who may be not living with that same level of authenticity. And I think, if there is a heaven, me being honest and truthful first with myself and then with the world, I got a pretty good shot.
Well, Meghan, I mean, the past couple of years, it seems there's been message after message from political leaders and religious leaders denigrating trans people, seeking to exclude them in many ways, and at times with very violent messages. So, how do you kind of obtain a positive spirit? How do you keep your energies and your optimism flowing?
It's hard sometimes. It hurts. I don't always show the hurt, but it hurts. But the way I approach it is that very few people, well, they're starting to get my backstory through the book, and there will be more storytelling books of seeing the things I've persevered through and made it to this point of my life. There's not really much anyone who's going to say to me at this juncture to derail who I am and where I'm going in my life. And then when I am confronted with those people, I just ask them, because they claim that transgenderism is going to be the single thing that unravels society and civilization. And I go, come on, it didn't even make the top 10. So they have no response to why it's not, one of the top 10s of the commandments, if it's going to be the one thing that unravels the world. So, I try not to lose any sleep over it, and I don't waste any voices on people who have no interest in learning and growing and changing their perspective. I'd rather help families and people who are struggling to figure out how they fit into the world, and use my energies and efforts to have more positive impact.
Well, thank you for that. Rabbi, Jewish theology and practice has often been viewed as more body affirming than those faith traditions who understand the body and sexuality to be evil desires. Yet Judaism has very strong patriarchal roots, and perhaps most dramatically evidenced in Orthodox Jewish traditions. So how do you interpret your Jewish understandings in relationship to sexual orientation and gender identity?
I think it's important to start by saying that there's a spectrum of denomination, of understanding, of interpretation, of belief in Judaism. I am a Reformed Jew, which is on the progressive egalitarian side. So I like to preface with that, but also to say that while Judaism has strong patriarchal roots, there's always been a place for women as well. And if we're talking, about the binary that so many people want to reflect upon, from our earliest texts onwards, there's a conflict between that idea of the binary and Jewish understanding and interpretation of the text. So from Genesis 1:27, right, which is my favorite verse of text, right? God created the human beings in the divine image, creating them in the image of God, creating them male and female. So the Hebrew itself is actually in the plural. It's them, it's not him, singular. And from that, there's actually a very, ancient, we're talking, thousands of year old interpretation story from our Midrash, from our folktales that say that actually the first human, Adam the first, Adam, was actually created as what they borrow from the Greek, the androgynous, right? That God created the first being with two faces, one on each side, and that they are then split down the middle, right, into this male and this female, into Adam and Eve. And the fact that this is a very ancient commentary story really speaks to what I think a lot of people are starting to learn about Judaism, which is that some of our oldest commentary talks about what is referred to as 6 different genders, but really our understanding between gender and sex is different than our ancient 2000 plus years ago interpreters. But the idea that there's not this binary, which I think for a lot of people, particularly coming from a Jewish or a Christian or even from Islam as well, perspective, what the quote unquote Bible teaches, this binary construction is not what Judaism has seen for thousands of years, but rather that there's a variety of understandings of how humanity exists. And while the basis of that is because traditional Judaism keeps males and females separate and requires different things of them, and therefore the ancient rabbis said, if you don't fit into this category or this category of male or female, if you're somewhere in the middle, what are your responsibilities? Where do you fit? And that's where we get the further breakdown of, which includes male and female, androgynous, borrowed from the Greek, which we'd use the term intersex today, the category of the eunuch, the category of Ilonite, a woman with arrested sexual development who cannot bear children, and then the term is a tumtum, which is a person whose sexual organs are recessed and you can't determine, where they fall by physical examination. Please note that we're talking about a text that was written approximately 2,000 years ago, right? So, the language that we might use today does differ. So, yeah, okay. Was there a second question? I was about to look at my notes for the second question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, as you're aware, I mean, in the U.S., I mean, particularly within Orthodox communities in New York City, but also currently in Israel, major debates around LGBTQ inclusion and some specific anti-trans rhetoric. How do you see Judaism contributing in that debate with the historic kind of inclusion theology that you referenced?
So I always like to tell people that you can use the Bible to defend any perspective that you want to have. Right? If you'd like to hold up the amount of times that, it says that the Israelites, you were slaves in Egypt, and therefore, treat others kindly as your main focus. Or if you'd rather hold up the one verse, in Leviticus of a man shall not lie with a man, or if you want to hold up Genesis as saying we're all created in God's image, right? Depending on what you're going to claim as like the foundational text, you can find interpretation to support that. That being said, I think Judaism has a very important role, and our leadership has an important role, particularly at this moment. Because my branch of Judaism, Reform Judaism, has been fighting for LGBTQ rights in some form or another from about the 1960s onwards. And there is a spectrum of interpretation and observance. But I have colleagues, Reform and Orthodox, actually in St. Louis, that are going on 4+ years of being down at the state capitol, fighting against anti-trans legislation every week. They both have children who identify as trans, and they're alongside that. Another Orthodox colleague who is from the ultra-Orthodox movement in New York, Rabbi Mike Moskowitz, is actually the scholar in residence for trans and queer Jewish studies at Congregation Beit Simchat Torah, which is the world's largest LGBTQ synagogue. There are actually quite a number of Jewish synagogues, founded originally as gay or lesbian, but having, embraced a full spectrum. And his writings, if people are, you can find his writings. He's written a couple of books. He does a lot of teaching as well. And he really speaks from a place of a straight ally who sees the humanity and speaks to that from our tradition. And then, of course, there's Rabbi Abby Stein, whose memoir, Becoming Eve, traces, her own journey of leaving the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community and her transition. If people are interested, it's a very good book. She speaks and writes a lot as well. So while there's, this within any group, right, you find diversity of opinion, I think vastly the numbers of Jews across denominations are not just in favor, but embracing that we have I myself identify as queer, and we've been ordaining clergy who are gay and lesbian and trans and bisexual for a long time at this point. And the root of it all comes from this belief that God doesn't make mistakes, right? That we're each made in God's image, and that we are each on our own journey. And it's not for anyone to come and say that, you're wrong, that you don't know who you are.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that. So let's move on then to Maher. Maher, over the past year in Michigan politics, we saw an alignment of conservative Christians with Muslims to oppose further codification of LGBTQ human rights in the state. And this kind of alignment of conservative Christians and Muslims has occurred within global human rights body, so that the most prominent opponents to LGBTQ rights have been aligned Christians and Muslims. And unfortunately, we know that many countries that define themselves as Islamic have some of the most repressive policies and practices relative to LGBTQ people, although Ghana and Uganda are quickly joining those ranks of Islamic countries. Maher, your Halal This Way initiative is somewhat bold amidst prevailing Islamic thought. I mean, recently I was driving somewhere here in the state with an imam who told me it is impossible to be gay and also be Muslim. In your research, in your writings, what threads have you found that could promote inclusivity within Islamic thought and practice?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, perfect. First, well, thank you for having me part of this timely and important conversation. It's an honor for me. Let me first give some context on why Islamic countries have like the most repressive regimes, or at least why I think that is the case right now. It's true indeed that many countries that define themselves as Islamic have repressive policies relative to the LGBTQ community or queer people. Mainstream Islam certainly rejects the LGBTQ community from the outset, and this is reflective of like the imam's response to you. You basically cannot be gay and queer and Muslim at the same time. The situation is complicated for several reasons. One reason, for example, is the fact that when the substance of Islamic law and theology were developing, and the rulings about same-sex sexuality and the sexual and gender variations that were present at the time were being debated in the Islamic civilization, the dominant worldview of what was normal in terms of human sexuality at the time in that region was understood in terms of binaries. People were simply like, you're either biologically male or female, and biological males are supposed to be attracted sexually to biological females and only to females, and the opposite is true. And both males and females must abide by gender and sexual roles assigned to them solely based on their perceived biology, basically. Obviously, there's another reason why the situation now is complicated or the way it is. I believe this reason is a political one. In some instances, some of the laws that were put in place to criminalize the LGBTQ community in Islamic countries are not really Islamic in nature, but constitutional. They were coded as law during the British and French colonization of the region, which was reflective of the sentiment of the West and everywhere else pretty much on this issue. The West, of course, left and progressed, but those laws and sentiments were left behind. The issue for queer rights has even become more like weaponized, like globally right now. And it's a topic of tension between the East and West. For Muslims in particular, this political tension is an issue like that the Muslims like just take a position on to kind of like distance themselves from everything that is Western. They almost have a romanticized version of what is moral, what is the moral position of Islam on this issue, which is one of a rejection. and they hold on to it. I believe that is not truly reflective of the Islamic scriptures, however. This leads me to the question you asked and what kind of like inclusive threads I have found in my research. In general, when we talk about Islam, we can think of it in terms of the legal system or the Sharia law that Muslims abide by. We can think about Islam also in terms of theology, or how the tradition understands the nature of God and creation. And of course, in terms of the scriptures, which inform both law and theology. In reality, when it comes to the scriptures, the Islamic scriptures, basically, mainly the Quran, which is God's words, and the Hadith, which is the words of the Prophet Muhammad, really careful analysis leads to a few conclusions. The Quran itself does not really have a definitive stance to forbid all forms of sexual expression outside of the conventional binaries. To the contrary, it has evidence to accommodate certain categories of queer expression. The Hadith also, or the sayings of the Prophet, do not provide sufficient evidence to forbid like all forms of queer expression. As well, to the contrary of that, they contain evidence alluding to actually a welcoming space for certain queer categories. That is to say, both of the Quran and the Sunnah, or the Hadith, Muslims' scriptures, leave us with a reasonable doubt to question the historical stance against queer inclusion, which makes this whole project, or the prospect of trying to find a solution to affect a change in a positive way, feasible and hopeful.
Maher, why did you title your initiative and your book Halal This Way? Perhaps clarifying for our participants the definition of halal and haram.
Absolutely. Halal is a technical Islamic definition that implies permissibility. When you say something is halal, it means it's permissible and acknowledged, affirmed. When something is haram, which is the opposite word of that, it means it's not welcome, it's sinful, it's not acceptable. And queer expression has been considered haram for the past 1500 years of the Islamic history. And my initiative, Halal This Way, which was born about from my journey and about my genuine belief system that Islamic scriptures and God's will do not align with the current Islamic position of rejecting the queer community. But I believe also like the work that has been done on this issue to try to accommodate the queer community, whether it's been done by scholars in the West or being pushed through political interventions or activist circles, it all like takes on this political role then more so than it does appeal to an actual Islamic theology that would work with the majority of Muslims. And I believe like there is a way to do this work, but it has to be done in a very specific way. And this is why my initiative called Halal This Way. Like I'm trying to say there is a way to accommodate and include the queer community within the tradition, but we have to do it in a very specific way. And hopefully like my work is trying to explicate that, trying to explain how it can be done so.
Well, Maher, as you well know, you are operating on the margins of Muslim community life, challenges in getting notable Muslim endorsers of your initiative. How do you maintain your hope, your energy as a gay Muslim?
Well, first of all, this is like a personal journey, like that has started with me since I was a child. Like really, this was like about a belief in a just God that could not have been the image of God that I was being told about. I felt deep down, no matter how hard I tried to explain that I am not choosing this behavior or this way or feeling, and so on. There was no space for my tradition to even like acknowledge the way I was. And I believe like maybe like there is a misunderstanding, maybe they're correct. I try to abide by their rulings. I try to do everything that I've been told to do, to no avail, obviously. And it turns out like the more I worked hard, like the more I looked in the tradition, the more I realized that even the scholars in Islam, even the jurists, even our ulama, none of them really have a grasp on this issue because there is no space theologically to think about a category outside of the gender binaries. What we've known was like male, female, males do this, females do this, and that's about it. The idea that God could create like a more people on the sexual spectrum was not something that they can possibly understand. So I believe like this is where the need needs to be focused on, to work on it from a theological perspective, to try to understand the nature of the human sexuality, to kind of like substantiate that males and females are not the only creation of God. And again, to the rabbi's statement, like these are not a mistake either, because obviously Muslims have seen intersex people, they have dealt with transgender people, but the default has always been you're either male or female, so we are going to assign you this gender based on your biology. Never, though, I mean, like Muslims have accommodated intersex people, but never for intersex people as intersex people. They have accommodated them as intersex people who are either going to be males or females. So I think like there is a need, a huge need, to kind of like push that theological understanding of what human sexuality is. And in addition to the work that has to be done as well in the scriptures and the legal system to kind of like not only understand that God creates more than a male and female, but also deal with it legally. Like, how do we deal with a person who's this way, like given the Islamic way of life, as well as how can we substantiate that work within the scriptures? How can we make it actually viable from an Islamic perspective?
Thank you. Wow, what a rich discussion with Christian, Jewish, Muslim perspectives, as well as Meghan's personal journey. I think, Stephen, we probably have time for about 4 questions. If people would like to put a question in the chat, Stephen will kind of manage those and ask about 4 questions, as we have just about 8 minutes.
Stephen, I can respond to Vicky's question in the chat if that's okay.
Oh, sure. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, go for it.
So Vicky wrote in the chat, for those trying to be supportive in all faiths, what do any of the presenters suggest in ways to be supportive and helpful? And I'll say I dropped a link to different group who I was watching a webinar they did this morning with a bunch of faith leaders of different denominations and lay leaders as well, talking about the most important thing is to speak up. That too few people are speaking on behalf of whole groups, right? Claiming to be like that all Christians believe X or all Jews believe Y, or all Catholic, whichever group it is, that there's too few people saying that and speaking out against trans and the rest of the LGBTQ community, and that the best thing that anyone can do is to speak up and say that person doesn't speak for all of us. That person doesn't speak for me. I might not know everything, but I believe, right, in the humanity of all, or however those words come to you.
Any other comments from any of the other panelists?
Well, we can also move on to Darlene's question, which is, how does one respond to those who say, if you allow this, then where will it end?
Jim, do you want to try that, given your concept of the extravagance of God? Where will it end?
Where will it end? That's good. We do not know, but probably not catastrophe and probably not apocalyptic. So that's been talked about a great deal. I think it will end in freedom.
I would add to that, that how many times over the past several hundred years have we had the chance to say that as well? You know, when will it end? And lo and behold, we're all still here and it's all still functioning. You know, I think it's a very narrow vision of the future based on a very narrow vision of the past that some people want to lean on, because change is hard. And why do we want to knowingly change things that are, you know, going to make our lives a little more challenging, because we have to learn again. So I think that, yeah, I just think we need to keep exploring, because as we explore, we expand our knowledge and we expand our understanding of humanity.
Thank you. Larry or Sandy, were you endeavoring to ask a question?
I wanted to say how incredibly impressed I am with this program, and how pleased I am that so many folks have devoted so much time and energy, sometimes a lifetime, to try to help us be more human and embrace our brothers and sisters. And I'm so impressed by the courage that some of you have shown by living an authentic life. And I was thinking about your comment, Rabbi, of participate and say, you don't speak for me, you don't speak for all Jews, you don't speak for all Christians, you don't speak for all Muslims. I think that's so important, because people can be overwhelmed by the loudest voices in the room, and often reasonable people are not the loudest voices in the room. And what I might add to that was a thought that sometimes I think there are people that are so frightened to let go of their rigid beliefs that will never find a path to them. But I think there are other people that we can find a way to approach if we aren't so angry about their resistance to change. And I think sometimes what's helpful is if we take an element of that faith tradition that they might know, so that it looks like we could be speaking a common language. So as a Jew, I might talk about tikkun olam, you know, to repair the world is to make sure that people aren't hurting, aren't excluded, aren't damned, you know. So if we can try to introduce a common language, we might have a path to those people who are less rigid and may just be clinging to what's familiar.
Well, thank you all. I mean, we've heard from multiple faith traditions that there are messages rooted in our faith perspectives that are affirming of trans people and of LGBTQ people. And it is important for those voices to be heard gently and at times with a great vocalness. And where does it end? It ends, I think, within our faith traditions with a hope of greater inclusion, of greater justice, and of greater transformation of ourselves, but also of the communities and the societies in which we live. So this is a wonderful way to begin a celebration of Pride Month, to recommit ourselves to the work of justice for trans people, for queer people, for all people. Thank you for joining us this evening, and thanks for joining us in the work ahead. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Thanks.